partners who share our mission to preserve local history and share the stories. So today we have with us Craig Sansonetti, who's president of the Ma Pa Railroad Preservation Society. And he is going to share the story of the Ma Pa Railroad, a small line that made a big difference. Discover how the Ma Pa helped shape the economy and culture of over 50 communities.
So, can you all hear me? I would prefer not to use a mic, but if anyone is having difficulty hearing, please let me know and I'll pick up the mic. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to be talking about the Ma Pa Railroad and how important it was in the development and the daily life of communities in southeastern York County in particular, but of communities all along the line. So, is everybody here generally, let me say first off, if you've got questions or comments that you'd like to make, please do that as we go. I'll be glad to interact with you that way. I think the talk can be more interesting if we do that. So, are all of you more or less familiar with the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad, or is this something new to you? New. Okay. So, then let's start out by just having a bit of an introduction. What I'm showing you is a timetable. You might want to move in this way, because I think I'm going to be in your way.
It's all right. Sorry.
So, what I'm showing you is a timetable picture from the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad, early 20th century. And you can see the railroad runs from York down through Delta and to Baltimore. And you can also see that that's not a very direct route between York and Baltimore. Now, if you have any familiarity with railroad timetable maps, usually a railroad will draw a map that defies the real geography, but makes it look like its route is the best route between any two major places. So this one is an unusual one in that it's geographically correct. It really shows the way the railroad ran, and it doesn't do anything to hide the fact that the Northern Central Railroad here and the Western Maryland Railroad here both had more direct routes between York and Baltimore than the Ma Pa had. Okay, Ma Pa means Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad, not Mom and Pop operation, okay? So let's home in a little bit more on that, and I would call your attention to the fact that along the line there are 50 small towns, every one of which is labeled, actually 55, every one of which is labeled on this map. What does that tell you about the Ma Pa? I think what it tells you is that the railroad didn't regard itself as a line between York and Baltimore. It considered itself a line whose purpose was to serve all of these little communities along the way. So, from the very beginning, the impetus behind the building of the Ma Pa wasn't about making a profit. It was about developing the isolated areas that were along the line. You know, we think about railroads and development of railroads as something that has to do with bankers and financiers. That's not the predecessors of the Ma Pa. So, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Baltimore was already connected to York and Harrisburg by the Northern Central Railroad, a good mainline railroad. Baltimore was connected to Philadelphia by the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Harrisburg was connected to Philadelphia by the Pennsylvania Railroad. But you've got this big area, the whole southeastern part of York County, almost all of Harford County, Maryland, parts of Baltimore County, that are not served by any railroad and that really have very poor transportation. And so it was the desire of people in those areas to have better transportation that's behind the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, it's absolutely correct to say that the driving force for this railroad was public demand. So in 1872, every point on here in green is a place where a public meeting was held, where the purpose was to support and promote the building of a railroad. And this had no central organization. These were spontaneous public meetings that were arranged by local people. So let's take a look at what came out of one of those meetings. This meeting was held in Jarrettsville, Maryland. And you see, on motion of Nathan Grafton, W. Taylor arose and stated he had viewed different routes and the road could be built for the sum of $12,000 per mile, and urged the necessity of the people taking hold of the road and putting it through. And you see, this is the resolution that was adopted at that meeting. That it's the sense of the meeting that the people of Harford and Baltimore counties have been long enough deprived of the benefits of railroad communication with the chief metropolis, that is Baltimore, of the state, and that they will use every means in their power and feel that it's within the means of the people to subscribe at least $5,000 of stock per mile to ensure the construction of a narrow gauge railroad. So this is not centrally organized, this is organic. But here's the problem. Most of the area we're talking about is more like this than like a city. And how are you going to be able to fund? Speaking of railroads, how are you going to be able to fund the building of a railroad through a territory that's so sparsely settled? Well, one important thing that happened about 1870 was the development of the idea of narrow gauge railroads. And there was actually something that was called narrow gauge fever that swept the United States. It was the belief that by building in the narrow gauge, you could get railroad transportation much less expensively than building to standard gauge, because the trains could run on sharper curves, steeper grades, and the overall construction was less expensive. So the way these railroads, both in Maryland and Pennsylvania, came to be built was financing through stock subscriptions. I think this is a method that we don't really know anything about today, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it in detail. The Peach Bottom Railway was the first predecessor of the Ma Pa, and it was chartered by the Pennsylvania legislature in March of 1868. It was authorized to issue stock of $1 million, but the charter provided the company could be organized after it had subscriptions for $100,000 of stock, and 10% of the subscriptions had been paid. So if you look at that, that means in order to be organized, the company only had to have $10,000 in hand. Okay? Stock subscription was a legally binding contract to pay for the stock when the railroad asked you to. You could subscribe the stock and not pay anything at that point. But when the company said, yes, we've got enough subscriptions to organize, now we need you to pony up the money, you made a commitment that you're going to do it. Okay, so if you look at this, you remember the railroad was chartered in 1868. This is from 1873, that's 5 years later. And at that time, $211,000 had been subscribed and only $16,000 had been paid in. So that was the result of working at it for 5 years. But the thing you notice is there are aren't any rich people, no Vanderbilts or Harrimans or James J. Hills or Leland Stanfords, none of that type of people on this list. These people are from Oxford and Hopewell Center and Dallastown and Slate Hill, Castle Finn, you know, little places in York County and Lancaster County. So let's see how this stock subscription stuff worked. This man, James Clark, he owned a farm of about 160 acres on Nace Road near Woodbine. This is right around the corner from where I live. This is the house he built there in 1856. In 1870, he subscribed for 15 shares of Peach Bottom Railway stock. And it's very likely that that happened at a meeting that was held in August in Muddy Creek Forest, because that was the closest public meeting to his home. Okay, so if we look, this was a big investment. Clark's subscription was a commitment of $750, 15 shares at $50 a share, and in today's dollars, that's about $18,500. This guy is a farmer of modest farm, things of that kind. They often chartered a train to go to someplace for their picnic. So this is really striking. This goes from the 26th of July to the 7th of August. I think that's about 12 days. And the newspaper article lists 7 different excursions that are going to be run on the railroad in that 12-day period. This was a big thing. This one is really interesting. In 1876, there was a big World's Fair, Centennial Exposition. Okay, this is the 100th anniversary of the United States. Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. This is what the Peach Bottom Railway is advertising. They're going to have special excursions to Philadelphia. You start in York at 1:45 a.m. down to Delta, 4:20 a.m. You cross the Susquehanna River, get on a train on the other side, and you get to the exposition at 10:30 a.m. Your ticket for this is a round-trip ticket that lets you come back anytime and on any day that you want. I think there's maybe a 10-day limit or something like that. But so this is a really amazing kind of an excursion, I would say. Okay, let's just, here, crossing the Susquehanna River. You know, a lot of these excursions cross the Susquehanna River. And here you see examples of that. And then finally, I want to mention Springwood Park. Springwood Park eventually became a privately owned park, but it had a huge swimming pool, it had other entertainment things there, and the railroad had special timetables just for taking people out to Springwood Park. Increased access to non-local products. You know, if you don't have good transportation, what you can get is what's made close to you. Once you've got a railroad, you can bring things from far away and get them. And you've got the ability to bring things in a way that's very much like UPS or FedEx today. It's Railway Express. Railway Express is how you send a package, a small amount of something from one place to another. And it rode in the baggage cars on the passenger trains. So this is the freight house where they handle things like Railway Express in Baltimore. And you see how much stuff there is piled up there, all of which has a bill of lading that's going to take it to wherever its final destination is. And then finally, we've got a big shift in agriculture where you're going from isolated areas livelihoods, subsistence farming, and now you've got transportation and you could get cash crops. So this is cultural, but it's also economic, and I'm going to talk about it later in talking about economic impacts. So just to sort of sum up here, this is a 1913 timetable on the Ma Pa, and I just want you to see how many ways this dovetails with the lives of people. So you've got commuter trains, okay? These two red ones here are basically trains to get you to work. You've got milk trains. If you're a dairy farmer, you've got to get your milk to market. This is basically a milk train. You've got the mail trains, two each direction, each day. And then you've got something that you might not expect. You've got these two trains, the basic purpose of which is to let people go from these outlying areas to Baltimore for a night at the theater and get back the next morning to milk their cows and do what they need to do on their farm. So if you notice, the northbound one of these leaves Baltimore at 11:40 p.m. after your time at the theater and gets you back to Delta at 1:35 a.m.
How many tracks were there so the trains could run into?
So the Ma Pa and its narrow gauge predecessors were always basically a single track railroad, but they had passing sidings periodically where the trains could run past each other. So this is what the passenger train looked like in those early years of the 20th century. Typically a locomotive, a baggage or baggage mail car, and two coaches, and a train like this could handle about 120 people. If you look at the statistics for the whole year, the average train had 2.06 passenger cars. That 0.06 comes from things like the York Fair, when they had very heavy ridership and they added more cars to the trains so that they could carry. But basically, the trains look like this. Just to sort of give you an idea of the extent of this service, in 1913, the railroad was carrying about 1,500 passengers every day. Overall for the year, nearly 8 million passenger miles, and the station in Baltimore was serving more than 1,000 passengers every day. And the railroad was sufficiently convinced that this passenger service was going to continue to grow that they had an architectural firm design a much larger and grander station for Baltimore. In fact, not just Baltimore, they also made plans for new stations in York and Bel Air. And this is sort of the architectural plans that were drawn for that new station in Baltimore. But it was never built. 1913 proved to be the high watermark for the passenger service on the Ma Pa. Why is that? Well, it's because the road between Bel Air and Baltimore was improved, was paved. A bus line started running on it, and suddenly there was a competition, and what looked like this huge passenger service began to drift down. The railroad concluded that investing in this was not in its best interest. Okay, so just give you a quick overview. In 1915, I don't want to belabor this, but there were 16 daily passenger trains, 10 Sunday trains, more than 1,000 passengers per day, more than 7 million ton-miles of freight. The railroad had about 310 employees. This number is a little odd because there is other reliable information that indicates that in 1914 they had 573 employees. So why that discrepancy, I don't know. And the operating revenue of the railroad was about $14.5 million in our current dollars. So this was a big operation. Okay, let's look at the economic impact of the railroad. And one of the most important ones is the expanded markets for agricultural produce. That's what those farmers wanted when they subscribed the stock in the first place. They wanted to be able to ship their products out and sell them. So, a prime case is dairy farming. If you want to run a dairy farm, if you don't have a way to get your milk to market within a few hours of production, you don't have a product anymore because your milk is going to spoil. So without the railroad, dairy farming in these areas was impossible. With the railroad, it becomes not just possible, it becomes a major agricultural industry. So this picture is taken at Felton. Felton was the biggest milk shipping station on the railroad. It got to be so big that it took too much time to load the milk on the train. And so the railroad started leaving a baggage car at Felton the night before so that the farmers could bring their milk and load it directly onto the baggage car. Then they just picked up the car and went on into Baltimore. When they came out, they put the baggage car on the siding, the farmers picked up their cans from there, and the car was left empty for the milk going on the next morning. This shows the milk platform in Baltimore. We're talking about 1,500 cans of milk a day, each one of which has to end up going to the right dairy when it comes in and going back to the right station where the farmer's going to pick it up. So this is a big logistical problem to be able to handle all of that. For Ma Pa, the amount of milk that was being carried into Baltimore each year, about 2.8 million gallons, if you work it out, is enough to feed about 55,000 children. And the Ma Pa ended up had more milk coming into Baltimore than the other railroads, the B&O, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Western Maryland combined. It was a major, major impact for the farmers and for the city. See, our doors all closed. It seems very loud. I guess they are. Can everybody? Yeah. Can everybody hear? Okay. 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 The next thing in agriculture is the canning of vegetables. We've sort of forgotten this now. You know, we think of these things, they come from California. But the mid-Atlantic 100 years ago was the prime area for canned vegetables and canned fruits in the United States. So this is a map of Harford County. The green line is the Ma Pa going through Harford County. And there are a lot of canneries everywhere. But there are a lot of canneries that are clustered right around the railroad because that's how you're shipping that product. So those canneries get in the empty cans, they get in the coal to run their boilers, they bring in seasonal workers on the railroad, and of course they ship out their canned goods. In 1912, there were 32 canneries being served by the railroad. 1907, 12% of the total revenue came from canneries. That's a pretty big number. This is the cannery at High Rock, which is along our track that we have preserved down in the Muddy Creek Valley. You can see there were a lot of people who were working in that cannery. So this had a big economic impact. And in 1920, canned goods were the single largest commodity on the railroad. 390 carloads of canned goods that were shipped out. as a major product of York County. Now with the Amish moving into the southeastern part of the county, there's a lot of tobacco being grown down there again. But 100 years ago, tobacco was a very big crop. Take a look at this. The Mead's Tobacco Company in Redline was a major company that was doing business nationally and internationally. In 1919, they had contracts to ship 2 million pounds of tobacco to France. In their collecting tobacco from farmers to meet that, in one day at Muddy Creek Forks, they received 385,861 pounds of tobacco that was brought in, it says, 295 teams. Can you imagine that? 295 wagons converging on Muddy Creek Forks in one day. All right, additional economic impact. You've got ready access to fuels. Coal and oil isn't something you've got in your backyard. But on the railroad, we had major coal yards in Baltimore. Almost every station had coal yard. This one's at Long Green. In 1920, 29% of all the carloads coming in on the railroad were coal. Here in York, we have Fry Brothers. This is a little different. They, you see, had a fully enclosed coal train. Oil, so you get a little further into the 1900s, oil becomes important. So here you have a coal trestle and oil tanks together at Evergreen in Bel Air. And look at how many oil tanks there were with that oil all coming in on the road. This is a big one for the long term of the railroad, the expansion of the slate and green marble quarries in Cardiff, Delta, and Langford. So prior to the coming of the railroad, there had already been slate quarries down there for a long time. And the slate was shipped out by barge on the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. Once the railroad arrived, that slate traffic started growing rapidly. 1,518 squares shipped by rail, about 61 carloads. A square is the amount of slate that it takes to cover 100 square feet on a roof. So that was big traffic. Slate shingles, high value commodity. And in the early 1900s, they were shipping about 1,200 carloads annually. But by the time you get to 1920, the production of slate collapses. Why does it collapse? Well, there are two reasons. One is that other competitive products are starting to come out that are cheaper than slate and are fireproof, like metal roofing. But a major reason is that the quarries, as they excavated the slate, piled the debris close to the edge of their pits. Now they've hemmed themselves in and they can't expand the pits anymore because of all of these mountains of debris that are around them. And so it becomes too expensive to enlarge the pits. And the slate is no longer competitive. Well, I've got to throw this in because I think it's so interesting. Peach bottom slate, we brag about how good this York County slate is, the slate from Slate Ridge. In 1851, peach bottom slate was exhibited and awarded the highest prize as the best roofing slate then known in the world. That reputation has held up. This is from a current bulletin of the National Slate Association. It's got various sources of slate and their expected lifetime. Peach bottom, at least So suddenly you get to the 1920s and the slate business revives, but it revives in a different way. It's no longer shingles. Now it's slate granules. So in, I think it was 1923, you have this large plant built at Whiteford, and the purpose of it is to grind up slate to make granules and dust. They go out there and they start excavating these piles of rubble that have a lot of slate in it that wasn't suitable for splitting for shingles. Now they take that slate, they grind it up, and they ship out the granules. So in 1923, the Ma Pa installed a long spur up on the Slate Ridge to this new plant of the Staso Milling Company. And in 1924, that paid off a lot because 1,250 carloads of granulated slate were shipped out. A few years later, the Funkhauser quarry goes into the granulated slate business. Granulated slate is going all over the country from Whiteford and Delta. This is just one example. But this is the freight waybill for a carload of slate. It's going to Port Neches, Texas, and it's being routed over 4 connecting railroads. This stuff is going everywhere, also to Canada. Here you can see we start out in 1923 and Staso comes online and you've got a lot of slate coming out, and then the Funkhauser quarry comes online, and this granulated slate business finally peaks in 1950 when 5,763 carloads are shipped out of there. That's about 18 a day. This is 1960. We think of the railroad as in decline in 1960, but look at the length of this freight train. This is all granulated slate coming up the railroad out of Delta. Okay, then, what about the development of industry along the line? There was a lot. All of you, I think, are probably familiar with Black & Decker, tool manufacturer. Their big plant was built along the Ma Pa at Towson. Bendix Radio had a big plant where they were making radios and televisions along the Ma Pa, close to Towson. At Glenarm, the FX Hooper Company was a big company, and their product is a specialized kind of printing press for printing color images on wooden shipping crates. They had patents on this and they sold them all over the country, and these things were loaded on the Ma Pa and shipped out from there. Red Lion is sort of a poster child for the development of industry due to the coming of the railroad. So in 1880, Dallastown and Red Lion are sort of grown together, right? They're two towns that are right next to each other. Dallastown was an earlier town than Red Lion. It was far better established. So in 1880, Red Lion had 241 people. Dallastown had 842. By 1930, Red Lion had grown by a factor of nearly 20 to 4757. Dallastown had just grown to 2849. What was the difference? Red Lion was on the main line of the railroad. Dallastown wasn't. And so, in this time period, the population of Red Lion was going up and up because of the industry that was developing around the railroad. In 1912, Red Line had 49 shippers. That's in a place that had only a few thousand people. It had 49 shippers, and 21 of them were associated with cigar and tobacco industry. By the early 1950s, there were 28 shippers, 14 of them had credit signs. Now they're mostly in the furniture industry. And I cannot swear by this, but I got this information from the Red Lion Historical Society. They say that in 1950, when there were 5119 residents, Red Lion had the highest per capita income of any municipality in the United States. So, to give you an idea of what's happening at Red Lion, in October of 1929, just a snapshot, you've got about 50 million cigars being shipped out on the railroad. Tobacco, 10,000 radio cabinets, 5,000 crates of furniture, and then a bunch of small other stuff. Income, you've got more than 12 million pounds. This is all tobacco was the main product in Red Lion in the early 20th century. You had the Means Tobacco Company that we talked about before, with that 2 million pound shipping units. But you had many cigar factories with mostly women rolling cigars by hand to make up that 15 million a month. And of course, if you're going to have cigars, you need cigar boxes. So you've got cigar box factories. Well, the elders of Red Line became concerned about the fact that their economy was so dependent upon tobacco. So they set out and made a decision that they were going to try to attract furniture factories to Red Line. And they succeeded. So within a relatively short time, you had large furniture factories. The Ebert Furniture Company, the York County Chair Company, the Red Lion Table Company. That's only a selection. The biggest one of all was the Red Lion Cabinet Company. This is a aerial view of the Red Lion Cabinet Company about 1950. This building alone is a quarter of a mile long. This is a huge manufacturing complex. They're getting in 30 carloads of raw lumber a week and shipping out 60 carloads of cabinets a week. This is a huge business. It's putting a huge amount of money into the Red Lion economy. I just thought this was interesting. A publicity photo of the 1 millionth TV cabinet. Of course, the problem about this is you get to the mid-1950s and suddenly radio and TV cabinets are no longer considered furniture. And this business goes down rapidly once you get past the mid-1950s. In York, I'm not going to claim that all of this industry would not have developed in York without the Ma Pa. There were other railroads in York. But in fact, it did develop along the Ma Pa because there were valuable industrial sites along the tracks as the railroad went southeast out of York. And so as you followed those tracks, all along you see industrial sidings and companies, many of which names you may be familiar with, that flanked the tracks, and all of which were shipping on the railroad. This map is from 1934. The line here, the dotted line, this is the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad. Every one of these little circles represents a company that is shipping on the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad. And actually, the Ma Pa was the biggest switching railroad in York. It was the smallest railroad, but it served more industries than anything else. on freight traffic is changing. As you can see, from 1918 to 1950, the total amount of freight is continuing to go up. But in 1918, you had a pretty balanced kind of business. You know, 18% products of agriculture, 32 coal. Slate is minimal. Manufactured goods, 18%, less than cargo freight, 13%. It's kind of balanced. But look what happens by the time you get to 1950. That slate has really taken over. 58% of all of the total freight on the railroad is now slate. And that makes the rail, and the other thing that's still big is the furniture, 20% there. But the railroad is now becoming vulnerable to that one traffic. Again, you can see here, slate, furniture, lumber and wood products, which goes along with the furniture. Those things are really dominant in the railroads. And you've got a lot of
Is the green marble coming out?
Pardon me?
Is the green marble coming out of the slate?
So the green marble is coming from the Maryland Green Marble Company in Cardiff. And it was never as nearly as many carloads as the slate, but they continued to ship green marble out of there into the 1970s.
Was it a byproduct of the slate?
No, it's a different material altogether. Serpentine, I think, is the word. But no, it was. There was a deep shaft pit at Cardiff from which they cut large blocks of the green marble out, and then they tunneled back from the pit through tunnels to take out large blocks of the green marble, which was then sawn to make plates of green marble that could be used for facing on buildings and things like that. They also, then they took the waste from that and they ground it coarsely to make terrazzo chips that were used for that terrazzo. All right, so if Red Line is the poster for industrial development, Ma Pa in Muddy Creek Forks is the poster for small communities. I'm going to have to go quick because I'm talking too long. But Alexander Grove bought the village, basically the whole village of Muddy Creek Forks in 1888. And he and the railroad were a great combination because he was very entrepreneurial and he understood the opportunities that the railroad made for him. So when he bought Muddy Creek Forks in 1888, that's what was there. You had a small store, a little two-story mill. You had two small warehouse buildings that had been built when the narrow gauge railroad arrived. But by the time 20 years later, you've got all of these new things in Muddy Creek Forks. The largest general store in southeast York County. This thing that they call Machinery Hall, an agricultural warehouse and farm machine depot. You've got an expanded mill that now has roller mills in it. You've got a new grain mill. A.M. Grove has built himself a big house up on the hill. And you have a new house here that he's built to accommodate his work. So there's been a lot of development. By the final stages of this in 1923, all of these buildings are now in Muddy Creek Forks, almost all because of A.M. Grove. You know, these 26 buildings, 14 of them are directly related to the railroad. So you've got the A.M. Grove store. This is a place with about 35 or 40 people in Muddy Creek Forks, and they've got 1,100 family accounts because they're selling selling everything. Machinery Hall, they're selling this kind of stuff. Reapers, mowers, binders, cultivators. Those things are all being put together and sold in Money Creek Forest. This was a shock to us. We were exploring records. We have the business records from 1888 to 1945. We were exploring records and we found this ledger. It's labeled produce. We didn't know what it meant. But when we looked at it, we see he's running a wholesale business, buying from the farmers, consolidating and selling to retailers elsewhere. Look at this. We see shipments here of 36 cases of eggs. That's 1,080 dozen eggs. We just picked 1 month to look at. And in May of 1910, we shipped out 4,350 dozen eggs. That's more than 52,000 eggs. About 400 pounds of butter, 900 pounds of wool, calves, chicks, hens, roosters. All of that stuff is income to the local farmers he's buying from. And if you look at his total wholesale business, it was the equivalent of $1.5 million. That's all on top of what's in the store or the mill. Okay, you've got the Money Creek Forest roller mills. It's producing buckwheat flour that's shipped out on the railroad and white flour that's shipped out by the boxcar load on the railroad. You've got the grain elevator. The grain elevator is really critical to farmers because if they can grow a crop, the grain elevator will buy it. They ship it out of there on the railroad. If the farmer needs to get wheat to Baltimore market by himself, it's a 4-day round trip. But if he can take it to the grain elevator that's 2 or 3 miles from his field, now he's got a commercial crop. Fertilizer warehouse. They're selling about 100 boxcar loads of fertilizer out of Money Creek Forest every year in the early 20th century. Coal bins. They've got 5 grades of coal, and they're selling coal to churches and schools and things like that, as well as to individuals. The cannery. Okay, you see here, you put in a new siding. The construction of the new siding was the means of locating a large modern packing establishment on our tracks. And you've got team tracks, which is places where any shipper who doesn't have a private siding can have cars routed there to be loaded or unloaded. So all of this stuff is going on in Money Creek Forest, and all of it is dependent on the railroad. The railroad is also employing some people in Money Creek Forest. They've got a railroad section house there. 7 families are working for the railroad, maintaining the tracks and getting their steady year-round income from that. And this is the kind of work they're doing. Now you see the track at that time, this is about 1910, was in really pristine condition. So just to give you an idea of the amount of commerce and economic activity in Money Creek Forest, 1914, 1915, 1916, the mercantile appraisers figures made to $23. We're talking about $3.5 million kind of operation, just of A.M. Groves stuff. Okay, very quickly. What's the community impact? Well, you've taken a rural hamlet and you've made it a commercial center. You've got access to regional and national markets. You've got anything just about that you want to buy, you can buy in Money Creek Forest. Because A.M. Groves sold everything and it all came in on the track. Your consumer goods are a lot less expensive because the rail transportation has reduced the cost. You've got fast mail service and rapid turnaround, easy travel, and recreational opportunities you didn't have before. So it's a big impact. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes at the end here shamelessly promoting our museum. So, as some of you may know, our organization, the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad Preservation Society, preserves the village of Muddy Creek Forks and 3.6 miles of the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad through the Muddy Creek Valley. So, a really important thing about Muddy Creek Forks, it's on the National Historical Register, is that everything you see there is original. It's not reconstructed. It's not moved from any place else. It has historic integrity, as I think you can see when I do this. So, what do we offer? Well, we have a 5.6-mile train ride, motor cars, and this is maybe what brings most of our visitors there in the first place. But in addition, we have the A.M. Grove General Store. Pretty much everything in it is original. You visit, you talk with our docents. We have the Muddy Creek Forks roller mill and grain elevator. Again, things are basically original. And we have costume docents there to discuss it with you. On the second floor of the store, we have exhibits about the history of the railroad and the village of Muddy Creek Forks. We like to think that our people are engaging interpreters. We really encourage our visitors to talk with us because we can convey a lot more than you can get what you're interested in if you talk directly to our interpreters. Over the course of this summer, we do a lot of special events. And we do a couple of things that are just for fun. We do pumpkin patch excursions, and we do a Christmas event. But we think these are important things to do. They're a source of revenue, but that's not all. They attract people to Muddy Creek Forks who would never have come there otherwise.
To back that all up, to back that all up, we have an active effort with archives and collections, and we collect things from as small as a button hook to as big as a 124-ton locomotive. A lot of what we know about Muddy Creek Forks comes from oral histories. We've had an oral history project since the early 1990s, when there were still quite a few people alive who could tell us about the 1915-1920 period at Muddy Creek Forks. And so that underlies a lot of what we do. We also have, a few years back, bought A.M. Grove's house up on the hill above Muddy Creek Forks. We have it furnished in period furniture. We would like to open this to the public, but so far we are not managing the occupancy permit in order to be able to do that, and I think we are going to have to invest something in excess of $100,000 before we can do it, which is not in the immediate future. We have recently completed building up the track from Muddy Creek Forks a new facility for storing and maintaining our railroad equipment. And so that's just a quick view of that. That's the newest thing going on. And of course, you see our volunteers there building the tracks into the building. But everything that we do at Muddy Creek Forks depends on volunteers. We don't have any employees. So volunteers do the track work. Volunteers are the people you talk to when you come. They maintain the equipment. They maintain the grounds. So volunteers are key. And our volunteers would like to welcome you to come. So we hope you'll come down and visit us at Muddy Creek Forks. If you like what we're doing, we'd like you to become a volunteer. Okay, so This weekend, as I said, we have special events going all the time, and I'll just put in one more promo. This weekend, we're doing a special thing with antique photographs and ice cream. So if you have some time tomorrow and want to come down to visit us, you're welcome to do that. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that I hope, if you don't remember anything else from what we've said, that you will remember that the picture down in the lower right-hand corner, which some people seem to think is a sort of quintessential image of the Ma Pa, that emphasizes, its picturesqueness and its antiqueness. But that's not the real Ma Pa. That freight train over there with 2 locomotives and 30-some cars, that's the real railroad. All right. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been of some interest. If you'd like to pick up one, there are some brochures up here that have our museum schedule. And if you'd like to support us, there are membership brochures too. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to address them. And if you want to hang around and talk, I'm willing to do that too. But we need to clear out for the next, I need to get this down for the next speaker.